would the American Hockey League have a policy as it relates to, say, family violence? We've seen some issues in other major league sports where individuals have been involved in some difficult behavior. Would you have a policy?
We are behind the curve on that. We don't have a policy in terms of how one would deal with an issue like the ones we've seen over the last few months in the NFL and most recently in the National Hockey League as well. We do have, employee assistance programs. We do have places for players to go for help, whether it's that sort of issue or whether it's drug-related. We just entered into a performance-enhancing substance program, which is essentially the NHL Players Association education and testing program for performance-enhancing drugs. Tied to that in both the NHL and the American League is really kind of professional help that's 24/7 available to players and their families. At some point, and I hope it doesn't happen, but at some point I expect we'll be faced with a similar situation to have to deal with as what the NFL and the NHL have done recently. In instances where we haven't had those experiences, I will quite often pick up the phone to Mr. Bettman or Bill Daly, who is a good close friend of mine as well, and say, help, how would you deal with this? And oftentimes it's the player in question in any incident in our league usually is an NHL contracted player, so we have a common interest in dealing with it. And I must say I usually get pretty good advice from either Gary or Bill on how to deal with a particular issue.
Which leads me into another series of questions. This is not the typical negotiations that we would see generally speaking. I mean, you're a bit in the fishbowl. You've got 30 owners, you're associated with the National Hockey League. Where does the media, how do you handle the media? What sort of suggestions, tips would you give in terms of the media card? Because they can be very helpful and they can be not so helpful.
Yeah, I think I'm not as quick on my feet as some people are.
I don't believe that for one moment.
No, I believe it to be true, and consequently, I try to be pretty well prepared. There are only so many issues that the media have an interest in that you're likely to face, and I've just finished a couple of days of pretty intense media coverage of issue. We just suspended a player for 20 games for a failed drug test. We have an overtime format that we're using this year that is really interesting to the media across the National Hockey League, and we've got things that they're interested in. We have a potential growth of our league out to the West Coast. So those are kind of issues that every NHL media person touches on if I get a call from Damien Cox or John Shannon, I have a pretty good idea
what's coming
up. And I want to be very well prepared so that I can stay on message and be truthful, be transparent, but not betray any confidences or not betray any strategies that haven't been fulfilled yet. You have to be fairly cautious, and I would say in this day and age even more so. It's been shocking to me over the last couple of years to come to grips with the reality that anything that I say to anyone that's remotely media connected is going to immediately be on Twitter, and then like wildfire go to our fan base and go to whoever follows any of these guys on Twitter, and things go viral.
Am I correct in understanding the National Hockey League, they have a policy as it relates to Twitter?
They have a social media policy which is more the timing of when players can engage. I believe that's correct, in terms of pre-game, post-game. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that they are trying to sort of manage players' Twitter accounts or Twitter activity. I think there's some coaching that goes on with players about what Twitter is and about don't say things on social media that you wouldn't say expecting that they're going to be on the front of the sports page, because they are going to be there. And I think for players and celebrities, I suppose the bigger challenge now is that anywhere you are, people are using their cell phones to take pictures, and nothing is really private anymore for a player who is out in a bar or doing whatever they might want to do or might be able to do from an off-ice perspective. Now it's all public, or potentially it's all public. And I think players need to be aware of that. But for me, in dealing with media, I still don't think it was a misstep, but I had an experience, I guess a year ago, where I was frustrated watching NBC coverage of the National Hockey League playoffs, and the commentators ignoring the fact, or not, almost it seemed purposefully ignoring the fact that a player had come up from the American Hockey League, and they would give the background of the player and where he played junior or college and where he was born and what his mom's name was. But the fact that the player had been for the past 3 months playing in the American Hockey League and was just recalled, we didn't seem to be getting our due. And at that point, I was an active Twitter guy, only active sort of professionally to promote our league and stuff, but I had lots of followers. Well, I tweeted something out about, is it possible that NBC Sports and Pierre Maguire are really they would have to almost be intentionally not mentioning our league for this to go on game after game. Well, that was retweeted, I don't know how many million times, and became, it was effective in a way because it did make a difference going forward, but it really irritated some people at NBC, like really powerful people at NBC, and I don't think it irritated Gary Bettman, but he was aware of it. I heard about it, and there was, because that's their media partner, and so it's funny how something like, I was sitting at home, I was just frustrated, and I'd probably had a beer even. So there you go, you fire this thing off, and all of a sudden not too long after that, I decided Twitter wasn't a good place for me to be. So I'm there to follow I'm on Twitter following lots of hockey stuff and business stuff, but I don't actively.
But you accomplished your objective.
I did actually. If given the opportunity to do it again, I would still do it. It did accomplish an objective, but it was a good example of, to me, I hadn't really intended it to get that sort of coverage, or it was picked up by a lot of the big websites in the U.S. And the thing that was really actually cool about it was the people who were commenting on social media were in agreement. So we had lots of folks chime in and say, he's absolutely right.
David, tell us, have you had any failures in terms of some of your negotiations over the years, whether they be big issues, small issues, or in between?
I try to forget them. I suppose you learn from them, I suppose. That's an interesting question. I'm sure I have. In every negotiation, I would expect that I didn't get everything I was hoping to achieve. No question about that. There's give and take in everything, and I have had failures the greatest failures I've had are when it seemed as though the people that I was dealing with were not trusting where things were going to go, and went and just didn't believe in whatever it was I was selling, and went in a different direction. And it's, I've been in situations where I can remember many years ago attempting to bring Grand Rapids into the American Hockey League. There was a new building being constructed in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the International League and our league were competing for that particular market. The ownership of the building and eventually of the team was the DeVos family, who were Amway fame, the DeVos family and the Van Andels. And Mr. DeVos summoned me. We went out, we had a meeting, and I felt so good about, I was sure I had made the sale and that we were going to have our first team sort of west of Toronto. They went in a different direction. They paid 4 times as much money in order to join the International Hockey League as what it would have cost them to join the American Hockey League. And I could never really figure it out, why that fell through. And the calls stopped coming, and the whole thing just went cold all of a sudden. And the reason I use that example is because in 10 years later, in 2004, less than that, 7 years later, 2001, they were one of the teams we took over when we expanded and took over the International Hockey League. There were only 6 or 7 teams remaining in that league, and we brought them in to create a 30-team league in the AHL. And that was one of the sweetest moments ever, was to meet Mr. DeVos again and say, welcome to the American League. Because he had made a judgment that the other guys were going to win that battle.
In preparation for that, quote, takeover of the International Hockey League, what sort of effort went into that in terms of your preparation, having to buy certain teams out, to rearrange the league, increase the number of personnel?
We were in a very adversarial relationship with the International Hockey League. We were competing for markets, we were competing for players, we were competing for National Hockey League affiliations, we were competing for owners. It appeared to me that at a certain point that both leagues weren't going to make it, that it was, both of our businesses were somewhat
and by the way, just
poor.
The International Hockey League was around for quite some time.
It was. There was a very long history, much like our own. I mean, we're heading into we're in our 79th season, and they probably, if they were still around, would be in their 70th. I mean, they had a lengthy history. We began to really impact them. We attracted NHL teams back to the American Hockey League. Their player costs were much higher than ours because of that. They also had, I think, a vision that was a flawed vision, that they were going to become somewhat like the WHA and challenge the NHL, because they were in big markets like Chicago and Detroit and Houston and other big Los Angeles, other big markets in the United States. I think they saw themselves potentially becoming maybe having the chance to move some of those teams into the NHL at some point. So there was a bit of a flawed vision there. Anyway, their business was not going particularly well. And as probably often happens when these corporate mergers happen, there was one team on the other side that was getting nervous about their long-term viability and started to sort of sniff around whether the American Hockey League would ever consider them as a member. And once we saw that starting to happen, we moved into a discussion. We being actually myself, the stakeholders in our league were not really part of that conversation in the early stages, and couldn't be, because the feelings were so strong between the two leagues.
Real animosity.
Real animosity, to where if our owners got wind of the fact that we were thinking about entering into some sort of agreement with the other group, it would have been rejected for the wrong reasons. Gary Bettman was involved. And he and I had some conversations, and he said, would you entertain? And I said, yes, we would. But I said we have to be very careful how we go down that path. And in the end...
so process must have become very important.
Process was very important, and getting the right people to the table was really important. I had one or two members of our board that I felt would be supportive and see a long-term strategic value to our league to create one league as opposed to competing with the IHL. And in any business, sometimes that anti-competitiveness is not a bad thing for your business, is to not have to compete for the things we were competing for. So getting the right people to the table was important, and on the other side, making sure the other side got the right people to the table was important. And Gary was a bit of a go-between with some of that. And in the end, Mark Shipman, who is now the owner of the Winnipeg Jets, at the time was the owner of Manitoba in the International Hockey League. Wonderful guy who is now a really close friend of mine who I had never met before. But he became the chosen representative for the International League to spend time with me. And we, really just the two of us, worked out what we thought would be a fair way to get it done. And I knew that there were certain things I was going to need to bring to our ownership. We were going to need to sell them franchises. We were going to need to bring them in as though they were expansion teams. We were going to need to treat them fairly and make sure that they were going to get value for their investment in the American League, that they were going to be full participants, and that there would be no nonsense once we got things together. And we put together a package that I felt our board would buy. And I had to know what I thought would work for us. He had to know what his group could stomach in terms of spending more money. I mean, using the example of the Grand Rapids group, I mean, they had bought a franchise 4 or 5 years earlier for significant millions of dollars, and then had to come back and pay the American League, which they could have done 7 years earlier at about the same price. So they kind of paid twice. But I think that was an interesting negotiation, in that it was two people at a table And I had, as I said, one or two of my owners that were close by that I was keeping informed. He had his group that he was keeping informed, and he's a very good person, and he's very fair. And I think we were very fair with them, and in any interview he's done ever since, he will talk about the fairness of how they were treated and how great the result was for them, so how much better it was for them to be in the American Hockey League than what they thought it would even be when they joined.
So the International Hockey League, how many teams came into the...
We brought 6 in at the same time in 2001. It was a very complex endeavor because there were more than 6 teams in the International Hockey League. And so a number of teams had to go away. And with your legal background, you know that they would have had a strong case against both groups because of being excluded. So the International League group had to make those issues go away before we would entertain closing the deal. Fortunately, some of their teams had multiple ownerships, so some of the owners that came into our league just shut down other teams, and we don't allow multiple ownerships, so they couldn't bring them all in. A couple of the teams were in such dire straits that they were going under anyway, and the remaining group within the International Hockey League, the 6 owners that came to our league, basically had to clean up their business before they came in, so that any of their issues with the Players Association, any of their issues with...
So the International Hockey League is now dead?
It's gone.
It's gone.
Yeah.
Would you say, from a hockey perspective, the fact that you determined that the American Hockey League would be a professional training ground for the NHL was probably the core foundation going forward?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in not only determining that it would be that, but taking the steps with our Players Association that it would do that. And that meant in any game in the American League back then, and it's with a few tweaks is true today, of 18 skaters and 2 goalies, we essentially said of the 18 skaters, 12 of them have to be, and this is not exactly correct, but close, 12 of them have to be on entry-level contracts in the NHL. So we said this is going to be a young league, and we legislated it. We actually legislated how many had to be young as opposed to not allowing X amount of older players, because you get into some age discrimination.
Absolutely.
That way, even 20 years ago you did. But our union, of course, was not very happy because we didn't negotiate it with them, which we should have. We ended up in front of the National Labor Relations Board, and fortunately we were able to show the folks at the NLRB that no players had lost their jobs, that in fact every player who had been in the league the year before and the year before that were still earning a living playing professional hockey, despite the fact that we had brought these rules in, which was very helpful to us from a legal perspective. And then we sat down and negotiated it. Have tweaked it a little bit over the last 20 years. But that foundation is what led to, the IHL going down and the American League being a 30-team league and being the basically exclusive player development site at the pro level for the NHL. And it gave us we brought in really good owners. We brought in really good cities. And they've been very good contributing members of our league from the day they joined.
Because I think in years past, you had the International Hockey League, you had the American Hockey League. They seemed to be vying for the same players, and nobody was talking really about player development. They were just talking about those teams, and the NHL was sort of off in the background. But now it seems to be a much more stable, much more influential, you have much more impact in terms of player development and professional hockey across the board.
Well, we do, and I think as we talk about negotiation, if I think back to what was happening in the days of the 2 leagues, an example would be the Ottawa Senators had an affiliation agreement back in around 93 or 94 in Prince Edward Island. I remember that in Charlottetown. I mean, it was one of our tiny little markets that had a limited shelf life, but they were there. And the affiliation payments that they were receiving were relatively low. The IHL had cities with very wealthy owners with bigger markets, bigger buildings, and they would go to a team like Ottawa, and there were other examples of that, where all of a sudden we were paying maybe $700,000 a year for players, and the IHL said, well, we'll give you $2 million. So all of a sudden that NHL team stopped being an AHL partner and became an IHL partner. So our strategy was in '94, and I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's not always about the money. And we had to find out a way, because we didn't have the resources to outbid them for those agreements. And without those agreements, we were out of business. So how do we make an NHL team make the decision that rather than take $2 million for their player supply, they'll take $800,000? Well, you provide a better environment for those players to develop in, a better competitive environment, and you pay more attention to them, and you make them know that you are a partner for the long haul, for the betterment of their hockey team, their hockey players, and you build that relationship. And so, you know, if you track that back now, times X number of teams, if you've saved our teams, if they could afford it at all, $1 million each annually.
Very significant.
Yes,
Very significant.
And done really through collective bargaining and establishing that you're a different league.
And much more beneficial for the player.
Yeah. So what are the needs of the people you're negotiating with? In this case, the needs of the NHL team is far more important that their players are in a good development environment than that they have $1 more million. You know, Maple Leaf Sports, for example. No, it's a bad example because they own their team. No. But so in any negotiation, I think if it's a financial issue, and you know that you're not going to be able to compete financially, you've got to find some of those other variables.
So it's more than the price.
Absolutely. How do you meet the needs of your counterpart in a way that's non-financial? Or are there other ways where you can attack the financial challenge? And I was thinking, you know, before we began today about negotiating leases in arenas is another thing that we do a lot of. And when you think simplistically about a lease, it's either $10,000 a night, or it's $20,000 a night, or it's $30,000 a night to rent the building. But there are revenue streams in those buildings, and there are all sorts of things that you can negotiate other than your lease payment. It's your share of concessions, it's your share of parking, it's who gets the suites, it's who gets the signage on the Zamboni, it's how much time do you have on the video board, it's can you find office space in there so you don't have to rent office space somewhere else. So trying to find other areas in which you can meet your needs without negatively impacting the needs of the other party. And it's kind of finding a win-win solution. And usually you can do that if you're creative. If you think it through and stop getting caught up with the fact that they want 20 and you want to pay 7,500, and find ways to get yourself enough to meet the 20. Or find ways that you can provide things for them that will help them so you can knock the 20 down.
Our time is just about up, but I have two questions. One is, how have you dealt with difficult people on the other side? Whether it's the lease or the Players Association or owners. What's been your track record, so to speak, in terms of trying to deal with difficult people? I really like the example of one that's deceptive. How you put it in writing and it seems to go away, but other examples?
Yeah, I think I lose a lot of sleep over difficult people. I take things personally when you're in a negotiation and it's good faith and you're finding that you're dealing with someone who's not dealing in good faith, or you know actually has a different set of objectives, or is deceptive in what they're doing. I lose a lot of sleep over that because I take it personally, and one shouldn't. It's a bad thing to do, especially when you've been at it as long as I have. One should be able to realize that tomorrow's another day, and it'll get better, or you'll stop having to deal with the guy because it isn't going to get better. But I think you're going to run into that no matter what field you're in. You're going to run into unreasonable people. You're going to run into dishonest people, unfortunately. And frankly, sometimes you're best served by just having the negotiation fail and not having to deal with those people down the road. Because I think once somebody's a bad partner, they're probably always a bad partner. I just think there are people that you're better off not having to deal with. But when you do, I haven't found a solution that I could tell you to overcome dealing with someone who is not dealing in good faith, other than tomorrow's another day, just keep coming back, keep working it. There's going to be situations where you don't always get it done.
Now, David, you've had some incredible experiences, tremendous amounts of success in your professional career as a president and as a CEO. I mean, the record is very clear and it's very obvious. But if you were advising university students in third or fourth year who may be attempting to try to get a job or to seek out a career, what advice would you give to that young woman or young man as they embark upon trying to develop a new career?
Well, I think firstly, find your passion. I think follow something that you really want to do and really have an interest in. I don't think it should be about the career before it's about what it is you enjoy doing. That's easily said. I think a lot of young people probably feel very guilty because they're not sure what they want to do yet, and that's pretty standard. I think kids ought to know, or students ought to know, that if you don't know what you want to be when you're 21, it's not like very uncommon. And I don't think there's a direct path now for unless you're in a profession such as medicine or law, in terms of academically what you're going to do. I don't think it's a direct path to an end career. I think it's all about finding something you really want to do. And I think the best way to get started is volunteerism. I think it's internships, it's volunteerism, it's being around people who are doing that which you would like to be doing, and getting noticed that way. And to me, when we hire students, we've hired a lot of our interns. So internships are a really good thing to do, and get them in a place and do them in a field that you'd like to be in. And when you're there, show a good work ethic, demonstrate that you can be a good team player with the people that are in that particular setting you're in. We've hired a lot of kids that have simply shown how hard they're willing to work and how well they fit in with the rest of our group, and how much of a passion they have for what they're doing. To me, the last thing I would say is, in everything that you do, take pride in your performance. And whether that's as a student or as an intern or as a volunteer, to me, people that show pride in their performance shine through. You see that. You see it at every turn, that an employee or a student or someone in any endeavor you're around really takes pride in what they do. And I think if a person does that, they're going to be successful. And then the other last thing I would say is, don't be afraid to take some risks. I think all of us have taken risks along the way in our career where you kind of project yourself and say, am I going to be happy with this new career path, and try to put yourself in your own shoes over there and see whether it feels like a good fit. But I don't think you should ever not do it for fear of not wanting to take the chance, because life's too short to not take the odd chance. So I think most people who have had interesting careers have probably done a number of different things, as I know you have, a whole lot of different things, and done them all successfully, and one leads to the other, and it makes for an interesting life.
Well, that's very, very good advice. On behalf of the faculty and students at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University, I want to thank you for giving your time today, and of course your wiseful insights in terms of the negotiating process. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's great.